He didn't knock. He never knocked. The man in the black tactical vest shoved the emergency room doors open with both hands, and the first thing he did was grab the nearest patient, an 18-year-old Marine with a shattered knee and a drainage tube still taped to his thigh, and press the barrel of a Glock directly against the boy's temple. "Nobody moves," he said, "or I paint the wall with this kid." The nurses screamed, the monitors shrieked, and at the far end of the corridor, a small woman in blue scrubs looked up from her clipboard, said nothing, and went very, very still. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow Rebecca's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Her name badge said Rebecca O'Connell, RN. It was a real name, a real license, a real social security number attached to a real woman who had once lived in Pensacola and liked black coffee and stayed quiet in meetings. Everything else about her was constructed. The apartment she rented near the base was sparse in a way that looked like minimalism, but was actually readiness. The running shoes by the door were always laced. The go bag under the bed had been packed and repacked so many times the zipper had started to fray. She had been at San Diego Naval Medical Center for 6 weeks, and in that time she had learned the layout of every corridor, the location of every fire exit, the rotation schedule of every security guard, and the precise distance from the nurse's station to the trauma bay, 41 feet 12 seconds at a brisk walk, 6 seconds at a run. She had not learned these things because she was paranoid. She had learned them because it was the only way she knew how to exist inside a building. The other nurses called her Mouse. Not to be cruel, at least most of them didn't mean it cruelly, but because she was small and she was quiet, and she had a habit of appearing in places without anyone noticing she'd arrived. Dr. Carl Whitmore, the senior trauma attending, who believed that intimidation was a form of mentorship, had said it the loudest on her 3rd day. He turned around during a resuscitation and found her already standing where he needed her to be, passing him the instrument he'd been about to ask for, and he'd actually flinched. "Where the hell did you come from?" he'd said, and one of the residents had laughed and said, "She's like a mouse, she just appears." And that had been that Mouse, the quiet one, the new one, the one who probably couldn't handle a real trauma. Rebecca had smiled and said nothing and filed the observation away. People who underestimated you were people who wouldn't see you coming. She had learned that lesson somewhere between her 2nd deployment and her 3rd in a place she was not allowed to name from a man who was no longer alive to name it either. She was reviewing medication charts at the nurse's station when it happened. Not because she was slow, she processed information at a speed that would have surprised every person in that building, but because she was deliberately presenting as slow. That was the work. That was the cover. You moved at the pace of the role until the role required something else from you, and then you shifted and you made the shift look like panic so that no one recognized it as precision. The explosion came first, not a large one, a charge, probably a breaching device somewhere near the service entrance on the south side of the building. Rebecca identified it immediately, and her eyes went to the clock on the wall, 22:14. She counted backward from the sound and calculated the distance. 40, maybe 50 meters. South corridor, near the loading dock. The monitors kept beeping. The overhead lights didn't flicker. Nobody else looked up. Then the doors opened. There were 4 of them in the first wave. She clocked them in under 2 seconds. Tactical vest, no insignia. 2 with AR platform rifles, 2 with sidearms. The one in front, the one who grabbed the Marine, was the leader. She could tell by the way the others waited for him to finish speaking before they moved. He had authority, and he was performing it loudly, which meant he was also managing fear. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. He'd done this before, but not often enough to be comfortable. "Everyone on the floor," he said. His voice was controlled professional, which was more dangerous than rage. "On the floor now. Any hero tries to be a hero, we start with the patients." The waiting room collapsed into screaming. Chairs scraped. Someone knocked over a tray of instruments, and the sound of metal hitting tile was almost as loud as the initial bang. Dr. Whitmore appeared from behind the curtain of Bay 3, took one look at the man with the Glock pressed to the Marine's head, and went white to the hairline. What do you want?" Whitmore said. His voice cracked on the second word. Rebecca noted it without judgment. He was a skilled physician. He had just never been trained for this. "I want everyone to sit down and shut up." the leader said. We're not here for you. We're here for something in this building, and when we find it, we walk out, and every one of you goes home tonight. You make this difficult, nobody goes home. Are we clear? Rebecca had already moved. Not toward the threat, not yet, but in the opposite direction toward the supply corridor. A motion so unhurried and so consistent with the general chaos of frightened people pressing themselves against walls that not one of the armed men tracked her. She reached the alcove near the medication room, pressed her back against the wall, and breathed. 4 in the first wave. At least one more at the service entrance, probably 2, possibly a lookout on the perimeter. 7 to 9 total if she was modeling this correctly, and she was almost always modeling correctly. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and wrapped her fingers around the trauma shears clipped there. 6 inches of stainless steel, 1 blade serrated. Not a weapon technically, except that she had once used a pair to puncture a man's carotid artery in a kitchen in Kandahar, so the distinction felt academic. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way she had been taught, the way she had practiced 10,000 times until panic became a language she spoke only when she chose to. Then she opened her eyes and started thinking. The thing that no one understood about situations like this, the thing that the movies always got wrong, was that the first 60 seconds were not the time for action. The first 60 seconds were for information. You watched, you counted, you identified the variables you could control and the ones you couldn't. You located the most vulnerable people in the room, and you calculated the fastest route between yourself and each of them. And then only then did you decide what to do next. She identified the Marine first, 18, maybe 19. His face had gone gray, not from blood loss. The drainage was controlled. She'd checked his chart an hour ago, but from shock and the very reasonable terror of having a gun at his head. His name was Corporal Danny Reyes. She knew because she'd talked to him during his admission. He'd told her he was from El Paso, that his mom had driven 14 hours to see him, that he was afraid the knee would keep him out of his second deployment. He had not seemed like a boy who expected to die in a hospital bed in San Diego, and she intended to make sure he didn't. She identified Dr. Whitmore second. He was standing in the open, which was tactically terrible, but she couldn't move him without drawing attention. She would need to trust that he had enough self-preservation instinct to stay still. She identified the charge nurse Paula Chen on her knees behind the central station. Paula was shaking, but she was shaking quietly, and she had not made a sound since hitting the floor, which meant she was frightened but functional. Good. She identified the armed men by position. Leader northeast corner controlling Reyes. Man 2 northwest covering the waiting room. Man 3 at the double doors, AR up, watching the corridor toward the surgical suites. Man 4 was moving. She could hear the footsteps, the rattle of equipment working his way toward the back offices. Looking for something. Looking for someone. That was the piece she didn't have yet. Who they wanted. And until she had it, she could not act, because acting without information was not bravery. It was gambling with other people's lives. She pressed deeper into the alcove and listened. Where's the administrator on call? Man 4's voice coming from the direction of the back corridor. Someone tell me right now where the on-call administrator is, or I start breaking things. Nobody answered. She heard a door open, then slam. There's supposed to be a secure room back here, the leader said. He was still in the northeast corner. She tracked his voice precisely. Basement level restricted access. Someone in this building has a key card. So that was it. Not a patient. Not a person. A room. Which meant data or supplies or something classified. Military hospital restricted basement access. There were pharmaceutical stores down there, yes. But there were also server banks that handled encrypted patient records tied to active duty personnel, and there was at least one secure communication relay that she knew about, because she'd seen the cable routing on her first walk of the building and recognized the infrastructure immediately. Someone wanted what was in that basement, and they had decided that a Wednesday night in the emergency department was the right time to come for it. She was already replanning. Nobody has to get hurt, the leader said louder, now addressing the room. I'm going to say that one more time. This is a transaction. We get what we came for and we leave. But I need the administrator's key card, and I need it in the next 5 minutes, or I'm going to start demonstrating that I'm not making idle threats. He pressed the gun harder against Reyes's temple. The boy made a sound, a short choked sound, the kind you make when the body registers a threat before the mind can catch up to it. And Rebecca felt something move in her chest, not sentiment, not exactly, but a kind of cellular certainty about what she was going to do next. She stepped out of the alcove. She didn't run. She walked. She kept her shoulders slightly hunched, her chin down, her eyes wide in the way that frightened people held their eyes wide, and she moved along the wall toward the nurse's station, and not one of the armed men looked at her because she looked like exactly what she wanted them to see. A scared nurse. A small, scared nurse making her way to cover because she didn't know what else to do. She reached the station and crouched beside Paula Chen. "Paula," she said very quietly, "look at me." Paula turned her head. Her eyes were red, her breathing was fast and shallow. "Rebecca," she whispered. "Oh God. Rebecca, what do we do? I need you to stay right here and stay low. Don't look at them, don't speak. Can you do that?" "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to handle it." Paula stared at her. Something shifted in her expression. Confusion, probably because that was not what you expected the mouse to say. "You're going to handle it. Rebecca, those men have guns." "Paula." Rebecca met her eyes and put something into her voice that she rarely used, something that lived under the quiet, something that had a weight to it. "Stay down." Paula went still. Rebecca turned her head and looked at the room. Man 3 was still at the doors. Man 2 was still covering the waiting room. The leader still had Reyes. Man 4 was in the back corner. She did the math. She needed the leader occupied. She needed Man 4 distracted. She needed Man 3's angle disrupted. And she needed all of it to happen in the right sequence, because sequence was everything. And sequence was the thing that people without training never understood. They thought combat was power, and it wasn't. Combat was timing. She reached up to the counter above her head, found the desk phone by touch, and lifted the handset without looking. She pressed the button for the intercom system, a facility-wide broadcast, something she had located and memorized in her first week, and held down the button. "This is a staff announcement," she said, and her voice came through every speaker in the building, calm and flat and institutional. "All personnel in the South Corridor, please report to the loading dock for an emergency supply phone delivery. Repeat, all South Corridor personnel to the loading dock." She put the phone down. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then she heard Man 4's footsteps change direction. He'd reacted to the announcement, moved toward the South Corridor instinctively. It was a small movement, a partial one. He hadn't abandoned his post, but it had shifted his angle, and it had taken his attention off the door to the back office, which was what she needed. "Who did that?" the leader said. His voice snapped across the room. "Who just used the intercom?" Silence. "Someone in this room used the intercom. Which one of you thinks that was smart?" Rebecca stood up from behind the nurse's station. Every head in the room turned. The leader's eyes found her, and she watched him process what he was seeing. Small woman, blue scrubs, no weapon visible, and she watched him decide she was not a threat, because most people decided that, and most people were wrong. "It was me," she said. "I used the intercom." The leader looked at her for a long moment. "Why, Bao?" "Because you said you wanted the administrator's key card," she said. "Administrator Chen is in the South Wing. I was trying to bring her to you faster." It was a lie, and it was a lie she'd constructed in 15 seconds based on what she'd overheard, and it had enough internal logic to hold for the time she needed. The leader studied her. "You're a nurse." "Yes." "You're trying to help us." "I'm trying to make sure nobody gets shot," she said. "That's what nurses do. We try to keep people alive." Something moved in his expression. Not softness, this man didn't soften, but recalculation. She had introduced a variable he hadn't expected. A cooperative witness. Someone who appeared to be managing the situation for his benefit. "What's your name?" he said. "Rebecca." "All right, Rebecca. You're going to walk me to Administrator Chen. She's in the South Wing." Then we walked to the South Wing. She nodded. She kept her hands visible, kept her posture compliant, and she moved toward him across the emergency room floor. And as she moved, she calculated angles, measured distances, identified the moment. Not yet, not yet. The timing had to be right, and she breathed. Reyes looked at her as she got closer. The boy's eyes were desperate, and she gave him the smallest movement of her head. 1 millimeter. "Don't panic. I see you." She didn't know if he understood. She hoped he did. "Walk in front of me," the leader said. He transferred the gun from Reyes's temple to the air beside Rebecca's head, keeping it raised. He still had one hand on Reyes's shoulder. That was his mistake. He was managing two things at once, and managing two things at once meant he was not managing either one fully. She had seen that before. She had used it before. She started walking. They moved through the emergency room, past the curtained bays, past the frightened faces of staff pressed against walls and crouching behind equipment. She kept her pace steady. She kept her hands down. She counted steps. At 17 steps, they passed the supply cabinet beside Bay 4. She knew that cabinet. She had restocked it herself twice in the last 2 weeks. She knew the bottom shelf held, among other things, a roll of heavy-duty medical tubing, the kind used for chest drainage systems, and she knew that roll was approximately 18 inches long and approximately 4 pounds when fully loaded. She knew this the way she knew everything in the building. She had made herself know it. She had made herself know it because the day always came when knowing it mattered. She turned her head slightly as if she was going to say something to the leader, and as she turned, she let her left shoulder drop and her left arm swung naturally toward the cabinet. Her hand found the cabinet handle. She pulled. The door opened. The leader said, "Hey." She had the tubing in her hand before he finished the word. She dropped her weight, pivoted left, and drove the heel of her right palm upward into his gun hand with enough force that the weapon discharged into the ceiling. The crack of the shot was enormous in the enclosed space. Someone screamed. She caught his wrist on the follow-through, twisted, felt the joint given exactly the way she'd been trained to make it give, and the gun dropped. He was bigger than her by 80 pounds. She had known that going in. She had also known it didn't matter. She swept his forward leg, leveraged his own momentum, and he went down hard onto his back on the linoleum. Before he could recover, she had the barrel of his own weapon pointed at the center of his forehead and her knee on his chest, and she looked up. Man 2 had his rifle up. "Put it down," she said, not loudly, not as a plea, as a statement of fact, the way you stated the sun was coming up, because it was coming up, and the sun didn't care whether you believed in it or not. Man 2 didn't put it down, but he didn't shoot. Those 2 seconds were all she needed. Paula Chen, who had been crouched behind the nurse's station, who had been terrified, who had been told to stay down, picked up the metal IV stand beside her and swung it in a wide arc that connected with Man 2's rifle and sent it skittering across the floor. The sound of it was loud and absolute. Man 2 turned toward the motion. Rebecca was already moving. She crossed the distance between them in 6 steps, did 3 things in rapid sequence that were too fast for anyone watching to fully describe later, and Man 2 went down beside the supply cabinet with his hands zip-tied behind him. She had found zip ties in the cabinet alongside the tubing because she had known they were there. Silence. Real silence, the kind that follows a shock so complete that even the fear hasn't caught up with itself yet. Reyes said "holy" and stopped. Dr. Whitmore said nothing. He was staring at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the periodic table has an element no one told him about. Rebecca breathed. She stood with the leader's gun in her hand, safety on now, and did the count she always did after. Herself functional, injuries none detectable, threats neutralized 2, threats remaining Man 3 at the doors, Man 4 in the corridor, plus however many outside. She looked at the doors. Man 3 had taken 2 steps into the room, rifle up, trying to find his sight picture in the chaos of the last 12 seconds. "Don't," she said. He hesitated. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know about how prepared these men had been for resistance. Professionals didn't hesitate. Amateurs, who'd expected no resistance, hesitated when they found it. "Your partners are down," she said. "You can add yourself to that, or you can put the rifle on the floor and I'll make sure you're treated humanely. Your choice, and you've got about 4 seconds to make it." He looked at his partners on the floor. He looked at her. He was doing the same calculations she'd done 40 minutes ago, in the alcove counting variables, measuring odds, and he was arriving at the same answer she would have arrived at. He put the rifle on the floor. "Hands on the back of your head," she said, slowly. He complied. She turned to the room. The staff was staring at her, every single face, nurses, residents, the terrified waiting room patients who had pressed themselves against the far wall was turned toward her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it before in other rooms, in other places, on the faces of people who had expected one thing and gotten something entirely different. Whitmore found his voice first. "What the hell?" he said, softly like a man speaking to himself. "What in the hell are you?" Rebecca looked at him. She thought about what to say. She thought about all the answers she had been giving for 6 weeks about being from Pensacola, about wanting to serve the men and women who'd served the country, about liking the pace of a military hospital, about being a quiet person who preferred routine. All of it true at the edges, none of it complete. She looked at Corporal Danny Reyes, who was sitting up in his bed with his hands no longer shaking, watching her with something that was no longer fear and had started to become something else. "I'm your nurse," she said, "and we need to start thinking about the two still in the building because they're going to come back when they don't hear from the others, and when they come back, they're going to be angrier." She handed Whitmore the confiscated gun. He looked at it like she'd handed him a live animal. "Safety is on," she said, "pointed at anyone who comes through that door and isn't wearing a badge." "I'm a physician," he said. "I don't. Tonight you do." She was already moving in. "Paula, call the MPs. Get them on every entrance. Tell them we have 2 hostiles contained and 2 unaccounted for. Tell them to treat the building as active until we do a full sweep." Paula had her phone in her hand before the sentence was finished. Rebecca paused at the doors and looked back at the room, at Reyes, who was watching her, at Whitmore, who still hadn't moved, at the people huddled against the walls who had walked in tonight expecting nothing more complicated than waiting to be seen by a doctor and who had received something else entirely. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been careful to hide. The one who had gone through selection at 18, who had learned to speak 4 languages and fire 9 weapons platforms and treat traumatic injuries in moving vehicles in the dark. The one who had spent 4 years embedded in places that didn't officially exist, doing work that was never officially acknowledged, and who had come out the other side of it with very specific knowledge of exactly what human beings were capable of doing to each other and exactly what it took to stop them. She had come to this hospital to disappear, to be Mouse, to be the quiet one, the new one, the one who showed up to work on time and kept her head down and let the world go by. She had not expected the world to follow her in through the front door. "Stay here," she told them. "All of you, stay in this room, stay low, stay away from the windows. I'll be back." "Where are you going?" Whitmore said. His voice had changed. The condescension was gone out of it, replaced by something she hadn't heard from him before. Something that sounded like respect, and underneath it like fear. But not fear of her, fear of what was still out there. She pushed open the doors to the south corridor. "To finish it," she said, and the doors swung shut behind her, and the corridor was long and fluorescent lit, and she was alone in it, and somewhere ahead of her in the building, 2 armed men were waiting, and she breathed and she moved, and the Mouse that she had never really been went away, and the thing that had always been underneath stepped forward into the light. The south corridor was 48 feet long and smelled like antiseptic and old carpet, and the particular kind of fear that buildings absorb when something terrible happens inside them. Rebecca moved along the left wall, staying below the sight line of the security cameras she'd already mapped in her first week, not because she was hiding from the building, but because whoever was monitoring this operation from outside might be feeding information to the 2 men still active in the facility, and she was not ready to be seen yet. She counted doors as she passed them. Supply closet, staff restroom, records office locked, physical therapy suite dark. The basement access stairwell was at the end of the corridor behind a fire door with a badge reader, and if the 2 remaining men had any intelligence at all, and she had to assume they did, that was where they were going. They hadn't come here for a fight, they'd come here for that room. The fight was incidental. She stopped at the corner where the south corridor met the east junction and listened. Footsteps. 2 sets. Moving fast, not running. They were past surprised they'd heard the gunshot from the ER. They'd lost contact with the leader, and now they were abandoning the original plan and moving to the objective directly. Get what they came for, get out. She understood the logic. She would have made the same call. She gave herself 3 seconds. She had a gun she'd taken off the leader safety on 7 rounds remaining in the magazine based on the weight. She had the trauma shears in her left pocket. She had the building, which she knew better than they did, and she had the one thing that training gave you that couldn't be replicated by adrenaline or anger or desperation. She had the ability to slow time down inside her own head while everything outside it moved at full speed. She turned the corner. The 2 men were 15 feet ahead of her, both facing away, moving toward the fire door at the end of the east junction. One was tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a rifle across his chest. The other was shorter, quicker in his movement, with a sidearm holstered and a bag over his shoulder. He was the technical one. She registered the one who'd been sent to actually access whatever was in that basement. She said, "Stop." They stopped. Both of them. The word came out of her with a particular quality, flat, certain, the kind of voice that the body responds to before the brain has time to argue. And for one full second, neither man moved. Then the tall one spun. She was already moving left when he brought the rifle up, and the shot he fired went into the wall 3 inches to the right of where her head had been. The sound in the enclosed corridor was enormous, a physical pressure against her eardrums, and she felt it in her back teeth, and she did not stop moving. She went low and drove her shoulder into his midsection. She was smaller, and smaller meant lower center of gravity, and lower center of gravity meant leverage, and she felt him fold around her, and they went into the wall together, and she got her right hand on the rifle barrel and twisted it toward the ceiling before he could get a second shot off. He was strong, much stronger than the leader had been. He grabbed her wrist with his free hand and squeezed, and she felt the bones compress, and she ignored it the way she had been trained to ignore it, because pain was information, and you could choose what to do with information. She drove her elbow back into his jaw. Once. His grip loosened. She drove it again. He went to one knee. The shorter man was behind her. She heard him coming, heard the shift of weight, the intake of breath, and she dropped flat, completely flat, face first onto the floor, and his arm went over her head where her neck had been. She caught his forearm on the way down, locked her legs around his knees from below, and pulled, and he went down across her back, and she heard his bag hit the floor, and something inside it shattered. He cursed. She was already getting up. The tall man was back on his feet. Rifle up. She was too close for him to get a clean angle. She knew this because she had been in this situation before, had run this exact geometry in training until it lived in her muscles instead of her mind. And being too close to the barrel was the only place to be when someone larger than you had a long gun. She stepped inside his reach, blocked the barrel up with her left forearm, and put the heel of her right hand into his nose with everything she had. He went down and he didn't get up. She turned. The shorter man was on his feet, bag, re-shouldered, and he had a knife. Not a large one, a fixed blade, tactical 4 inches, the kind you carried when the gun was a last resort. He held it correctly, which told her he'd had training, and he was watching her with an expression that was no longer confident, but had not yet become afraid, which was the most dangerous kind of opponent. Afraid, people panicked. Not yet afraid, people were still thinking. "You took down 3 of us," he said. His breathing was controlled. "You're not a nurse." "I am a nurse," she said. "I'm a very good nurse." "Put the knife down." "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I work here." He shook his head slowly. No someone put you here. This whole thing was a setup." He was rewriting his understanding of the evening in real time, looking for a version of events where he was the victim of someone else's operation rather than the architect of his own failure. People did that. It was a natural psychological defense. It was also, in this particular case, wrong. "Nobody put me here," she said. "You picked the wrong hospital." "Tell me who you work for." "I work for the United States Navy," she said, "as a nurse." "Now put the knife down, because there are military police on their way into this building right now. And when they arrive, you can either be standing upright with your hands behind your head, or you can be on the floor. Those are the options." He looked at the knife. He looked at her. He looked at his partner, unconscious on the floor. And then something changed in his face. The not yet afraid part caught up with the rest of him, and he looked at this small woman in blue scrubs who had put 4 trained men on the ground in the span of 12 minutes, and the knife came down. "On the floor," she said, "hands behind your head." He went to his knees. She crossed to him, recovered the knife, and had his wrist secured with a length of IV tubing she'd coiled in her left pocket before leaving the ER, because she had known she would need it, because she had thought 12 steps ahead when most people were still reacting to step 1. She stood up. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her right wrist ached where the tall man had squeezed it, and she flexed her fingers to check the range of motion, found it acceptable, and moved on. She checked the tall man's pulse, strong, steady. He'd wake up with a headache and a broken nose, and rolled him into a recovery position out of professional instinct, because putting a man down didn't mean you stopped being a nurse. The fire door at the end of the junction had not been opened. Whatever was in that basement was still secure. She found the short man's bag where it had landed and checked inside. Laptop partially damaged. A portable hard drive. A device she recognized as a wireless signal interceptor. And a folder of physical documents which surprised her with a cover sheet bearing a classification marking she had not seen outside of a SCIF. She closed the bag and set it against the wall. Her phone had no signal inside the building. The interceptor had probably been active since they'd breached the perimeter, but she'd calculated on that. She walked back the way she'd come, back to the East Junction, back through the South Corridor, and pushed open the ER doors. The room had changed while she was gone. Paula was on the radio with someone. Two of the male nurses, Marcus, and a tall, quiet man named Dev, who Rebecca had barely spoken to, had moved the leader and the man Paula had knocked down with the IV stand into the corner and secured their wrists to a bedrail. Whitmore was sitting on a chair in the middle of the room with his hands on his knees, and the expression of someone who has just ridden out a car crash and is still deciding whether they are intact. Reyes was sitting up in his bed. He looked at Rebecca when she came through the doors. "The other two," he said. "East Junction," she said. "They're down." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus said quietly, "All of them. All of them." Paula lowered the radio. "MPs are 3 minutes out. The base commander is with them." She looked at Rebecca with an expression that had moved through multiple territories: fear, shock, disbelief, and had arrived somewhere new. Somewhere that Rebecca recognized as the moment when a person realizes they never actually knew someone they thought they knew. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Who are you?" Rebecca looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the 6 weeks, the medication charts, and the night shifts, and the careful smallness of the life she'd been constructing. She thought about Pensacola, which she genuinely liked, and the black coffee, which she genuinely drank, and all the ways she had made herself real and unremarkable in a place where she could feel for the first time in years like a person rather than a function. "I'm Rebecca O'Connell," she said. "I'm your colleague, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything." "That is not an answer." "No," she said, "it's not." Whitmore stood up from his chair. He'd recovered something of himself. His posture was back. His voice was steadier, but when he looked at her, the condescension that had lived in his face since her first day was gone, and what replaced it was harder to categorize. It was the look of a man revising every assumption he'd made about another person one by one in real time. "Mouse," he said. He said it not as a nickname, but as a piece of evidence, the way you might say a wrong answer out loud to understand how wrong it had been. "I didn't mind it," she said. "I owe you an apology." "You owe Corporal Reyes a follow-up consult on that knee," she said. "The drainage looks like it's been disturbed. That's the priority." He stared at her. Then he picked up a chart and moved toward Reyes's bay, and she heard Reyes say something to him. Quiet, and Whitmore respond quieter, and the sound of the room came back in monitors, beeping someone crying softly in the waiting area. The ordinary machinery of a hospital reassembling itself around what had just happened. She went to the window that faced the parking structure and looked out. She could see the lights of the MP convoy coming along the service road, 3 vehicles moving fast, and behind them a 4th vehicle, black, moving faster. She tracked the 4th vehicle the way she tracked anything that moved differently from what was around it, and something shifted in her stomach. She knew that vehicle. She had ridden in that vehicle. Not this specific one, but the model, the configuration, the particular way it moved when the person inside it was in a hurry and had the authority to be. The door to the ER opened behind her. She turned. 3 military police officers came in, first weapons drawn, scanning the room with the clipped efficiency of people who had been briefed on the way in. They clocked the men secured to the bed rail. They clocked the rifle on the floor. They looked at Rebecca. "Ma'am, are you staff?" "Yes." "Are these the subjects?" "2 of them. 2 more in the East Junction, South Corridor, right side. One has a broken nose, needs to be assessed before transport. The bag beside them is evidence. Don't open it. Don't let anyone with clearance below. See, I touch it." The officer blinked. "How do you know the clearance level on?" "I read the cover sheet," she said. "I recognize the marking. Get someone senior to take custody of that bag immediately." He spoke into his radio. She turned back to the window. The black vehicle had stopped in the parking lot. The door opened. She recognized him before he was fully out of the car. She recognized the way he moved, a controlled economy of motion that never looked hurried and always covered ground faster than it should. Commander Dale Hutchins was 53 years old, 5'11", and had the kind of face that made younger military personnel straighten up without knowing why. He had been her commanding officer for 2 years of her life. He had written the letter that allowed her to walk away. He had not called her since. He was calling her now. He walked across the ER with the MPs flanking him and the base commander, a 2-star general. She didn't know behind him, and he looked at her the entire time he was crossing the room, and his expression was the controlled neutrality of a man who had expected to find something bad and found something different instead. "Commander," she said. "O'Connell." He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at the men on the floor. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her wrist where the bruising was starting to show. He looked back at her face. "You want to tell me what happened tonight?" 6 Tango, facility breach objective, was the restricted basement access. "I neutralized the threat." 6. "Yes, sir." "By yourself?" "Staff assisted with 2. She paused. "And I had the building." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. "You had the building." "I memorized the layout in week 1, habit." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the 2-star general was looking at her the way Whitmore had looked at her, with the particular expression of someone whose category system has just been disrupted. People had a folder in their mind for every type of person they expected to encounter. When someone didn't fit any of the existing folders, it was disorienting. She had spent her career making that disorientation work in her favor. "Your cover is compromised," Hutchins said. He said it quietly, not unkindly, the way a person states an irreversible fact. "I know. You knew it would be compromised the moment you acted." "I knew." She met his eyes. "I made a choice." He was silent. She knew what he was doing. He was running through the same calculations she had run in the South Corridor, weighing the variables, arriving at the outcome. Hutchins was one of the best strategic thinkers she had ever worked under, and one of the reasons she respected him was that he did not let sentiment cloud the calculation, and he did not let the calculation erase the sentiment. He held both. "There was a kid," she said. "Corporal Reyes, 19 years old, gun at his head." "I understand. I wasn't going to stand in an alcove." "I know you weren't." He held her gaze. "I never thought you would. That's why I approved the placement." She went still. Something rearranged itself in her understanding of the last 6 weeks. The quiet apartment, the unremarkable assignment, the cover story that was just authentic enough to hold under casual scrutiny. She had believed she had built all of it. She had believed she had chosen this. "The placement," she said. "You placed me here. We received intelligence 3 weeks ago that this facility was a target. We needed someone inside who could respond if the intelligence was accurate." He paused. "You were the best option." The room felt very quiet around her, even though it wasn't quiet. The monitors were beeping. Someone was on a radio nearby. The MPs were moving through the corridor toward the East Junction. All of it was happening, and underneath it was the information she was processing, this new architecture of the past 6 weeks and what it meant, and what it had turned, and what she felt about it. What she felt was complicated. "You used my cover," she said. "We used your skills. You didn't tell me. If I'd told you, the cover wouldn't have been real enough to hold." He didn't look away from her. "You know that." She did know that. That was the worst part. She knew it the way she knew everything about operational security, not as a philosophy but as a fact, something proven through repetition and consequence. If she'd known, she would have been different in the building. Subtly, fractionally different, but different enough for someone watching to notice. The cover had to be real. The only way to make it real was to let her live it. "How long have you known the placement was active?" she said. "I got the call 22 minutes after the breach." "So you've known for—" "I've been in this vehicle since 26, he said. "I didn't know if you were alive when I left the base." That landed differently than she expected it to. She had prepared herself for anger, had built the argument she was going to have with him about operational transparency and the ethics of running an asset without their knowledge, and the particular violation of being the last person in a situation to understand what you were doing there. She had that argument ready. She hadn't prepared for the 40 minutes he'd spent in a moving vehicle not knowing. She breathed out. The bag in the East Junction has evidence that goes above standard MP clearance. I need you to personally take custody. Already in motion. He glanced at his radio. My team is in the quarter now. There's a wireless interceptor in the bag. Whoever sent these men was planning to remote access the basement servers once they had physical entry. That's a planned operation, not opportunistic. Someone gave them the building layout. Hutchins's expression tightened. Insider. Has to be. The south entrance breach point was the service door, which isn't on the public building plans. Someone gave them access intelligence. He looked at the base commander. A look passed between them that Rebecca understood but stayed out of. That was their problem to solve. She had solved her piece of it. Reyes's voice came from behind her. Hey, Rebecca. She turned. He was leaning out from his bay, one hand still on the drainage tube, the other raised slightly toward her. His face had found its color again, the gray shock replaced by something younger and more awake. I just wanted to say, he said, and then seemed to run out of words which she understood. There were not always words for the moments that needed them most. You did well, she said. Staying calm, that helped. I didn't do anything. You stayed calm, that's not nothing. In a situation like that, it's almost everything. She looked at him for a moment. Your mom is still here in the city. Yeah, hotel 2 blocks over. Call her, Rebecca said. Tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. He nodded, something in his face, something young and frightened, and suddenly very aware of how contingent everything was shifted, and he nodded again, and she turned back to Hutchins. He was watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't fully read. What happens now, she said. Debrief. Tonight once the facility is secured. He paused. And then we talk about what comes next. I'm not going back, she said. I'm not asking you to. She looked at him. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for a moment. In the corridor, she could hear his team moving, hear the clipped radio exchanges of a facility being systematically cleared, hear the business of consequences. 6 men who had planned this for weeks, who had accessed classified intelligence to get through those doors, who had pressed a gun against a 19-year-old's temple, were now zip-tied and concussed and waiting for a very different kind of night than they'd planned. I'm asking you to consider, Hutchins said carefully, that there may be a version of what you do here that doesn't require you to be anyone other than who you are. She let the words sit. Around her, the ER was coming back to life in the way that emergency rooms always did, not celebrating, not processing, just moving forward, because the next patient was always coming and the monitors didn't stop and the charts didn't file themselves. Marcus was rechecking vitals. Paula was on the phone with someone, her voice steady now. The crisis metabolized into the next set of tasks. Whitmore was in Reyes's bay doing exactly what she'd told him to do, which was the consult that mattered. Dev came up beside her. He was tall and quiet and had said maybe 30 words to her in 6 weeks, and he looked at her now with a directness that she hadn't expected. For what it's worth, he said, I always thought Mouse was a stupid nickname. She looked at him. You never moved like someone unsure of where they were going, he said. I just didn't know what to make of it. He paused. I still don't, but I'm glad you were here. He walked away before she could respond. She stood in the emergency room of San Diego Naval Medical Center at 2319 on a Wednesday night, surrounded by the evidence of the last hour, the scuff marks on the linoleum, the hole in the ceiling, the overturned equipment, the low constant hum of a building reasserting its function, and she thought about what it meant to be seen. Not uncovered, not exposed, seen. There was a difference. She was only beginning to understand what that difference was. Hutchins touched her shoulder briefly, the way her commanding officers had always communicated what they couldn't say out loud. Then he moved away toward the corridor, toward his team, toward the next set of problems that her actions tonight had created and solved and revealed all at once. She went back to the nurse's station. She picked up a chart. She checked the time on the wall clock. There was still 3 hours left in her shift. She started her rounds. She finished her rounds at 2:47 in the morning. Every patient checked every chart, updated every medication logged. She did it the same way she had done it every night for 6 weeks, methodically, quietly, without fanfare, except that tonight the staff watched her move through the ward with the particular attention of people who have been forced to revise everything they thought they understood about a person, and the weight of their watching was something she felt in the back of her neck the entire time. Marcus handed her a cup of coffee at the nurse's station without being asked, without saying anything. Just set it beside her hand and walked away. She drank it. It was the best cup of coffee she'd had since she arrived in San Diego, or maybe it tasted that way because her body was finally coming down from the adrenaline and every sensory input had sharpened to compensate. Paula came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. "The MPs cleared the building," Paula said finally. "All 6 are in custody. The base commander is on the phone with someone in Washington." "Good." The short one, the one you zip-tied in the corridor, he asked for a lawyer before they finished reading him his rights. Like he already had one picked out. Rebecca looked up from the chart. "Which lawyer?" Didn't catch the name. Why, she thought about the folder in the bag, the classification marking on the cover sheet, the wireless interceptor, which was not cheap equipment, not the kind of thing a freelance crew picked up at a surplus store. Because people who have lawyers pre-selected for situations like this don't end up in situations like this by accident. She said, "They've been in situations like this before." Paula absorbed that. "You think they'll do this again? Try to come back?" "Not them specifically, but whoever sent them." She set down the chart. "They didn't get what they came for. That means whoever hired them still wants it." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Outside through the window that faced the parking structure, she could see the crime scene vehicles and the MP units still working the perimeter, their lights throwing blue and red across the asphalt in a slow, methodical rotation. The building had been secured. The immediate threat was gone. But Rebecca had lived long enough and worked in enough operational contexts to know that the removal of an immediate threat was not the same as the removal of a threat, and confusing the two was how people got killed in the quiet that followed the crisis. She was still thinking about the service door, the south entrance breach point, the specific non-public knowledge required to identify it as the path of least resistance into the building. She picked up her phone. Hutchins answered on the first ring. He was still in the building. She'd seen him go toward the administrative wing an hour ago with the base commander and 2 people in civilian clothes who carried themselves like federal agents. "The service door," she said without preamble. "Who authorized the layout disclosure for the last facility safety audit?" A pause. "Why buying?" "Because whoever they are, they're your insider." Another pause longer. She heard him moving a door closing. "We're already running that. The audit was 6 months ago, 3 personnel with access. We were pulling their files. One of them is still in the building tonight." The pause this time was the longest. "What makes you say that?" "Because the interceptor in the bag was active on a frequency that could only pull a useful signal from inside the perimeter. Whoever was running it remotely needed a relay point inside the building. Someone on the inside had a device. It may have been passive, they may not have even known what they were carrying, but it had to be inside." She paused. "Or they were here tonight on shift and they were watching to see if the operation succeeded." She heard his breath change. "I'll need you in the administrative wing. Now." She left the nurse's station, told Marcus she'd be back, and walked the corridor toward the administrative suite. The building felt different at nearly 3 in the morning, emptied of its ordinary daytime business, and not yet refilled with the next shift's energy. The ceiling lights were all on, which was unusual. Someone had overridden the overnight dimming protocol, and the hallways had the overlit, slightly unreal quality of a place still trying to convince itself that everything was under control. Hutchins met her at the door to the conference room. With him were the 2 federal agents. She could see their credentials now. DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and the base commander, Brigadier General Frank Okafor, who had the bearing of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered, and was currently learning that this particular room had other candidates. He looked at Rebecca with an expression that was more calculating than dismissive, which was an improvement over how most general officers had looked at her throughout her career. "Commander Hutchins tells me you have a theory about an insider," Okafor said. "Mana theory, Namamo," she said. "The interceptor in the bag requires a relay. Physics doesn't negotiate." "Could the relay have been planted in advance before tonight?" "Possible. But a passive relay planted in advance would have a detection signature on the building's network monitoring. If your IT security team ran a clean sweep in the last 30 days, they would have flagged it." She looked at him steadily. Did they? Okafor looked at one of the DIA agents, a woman named Carver, who had introduced herself in one word and not elaborated. Carver's expression did not change, which was its own answer. The last network sweep was 9 weeks ago, Carver said. Rebecca absorbed that without reaction. Then we can't rule out a planted relay, but we also can't rule out a human relay, and given the sophistication of the operation overall, I'd wait toward the human. She paused. Who had unscheduled access to the building tonight? Anyone who came in after hours changed their shift, swapped a rotation. Okafor said, "You're asking me to investigate my own staff. I'm asking you to identify who helped 6 armed men breach a military medical facility," she said. "The framing is up to you." He didn't like it. She could see that he didn't like it, not because he was corrupt or careless, but because the idea that someone under his command had participated in this was the kind of thought that a commanding officer resists the way the body resists pain instinctively before reason catches up. She'd seen it before. She waited. "Pull the access logs," he said finally to Carver. "Everyone who badged in after 1900. Carver already had a tablet. She was already pulling the logs. Rebecca watched her scroll, watched her stop, watched something shift in her face. "2 anomalies," Carver said. "One staff member badged into the building at 2142 and has not badged out. The other badged into the restricted basement access stairwell at 22:03:11 minutes before the breach, and also has not badged out." The basement access stairwell, the room they had come for. "Who?" Hutchins said. Carver looked up. "The basement access badge belongs to a doctor, Marcus Webb, staff internist. He's been assigned to this facility for 8 months." She paused. "The other badge, the main entrance anomaly, belongs to a nursing staff member." She said the name, and every person in the room turned to look at Rebecca because the name on the badge log was hers. She went still. "That's not possible," she said. "I badged in at 06:30 this morning for the day shift. I've been here continuously." "The log shows a second badge in at 21:42, Carver said. "Same credential." Rebecca and Hutchins looked at each other. "Someone cloned her badge," Hutchins said, "to create a false trail," Rebecca said, and the pieces assembled themselves as she spoke the way they always did, one click at a time. "They weren't just running an operation against the building, they were running an operation against me. If the breach succeeded, if I intervened, the badge log would show me entering at the same time as the breach team. It would look like I was part of it." The room was very quiet. "They knew I was here," she said. "They knew who I was. This wasn't just an intelligence operation against the facility. It was an intelligence operation against my cover." She looked at Hutchins and she saw in his face what she felt in her chest, not surprise exactly, but the particular cold clarity of confirmation. Someone had known she was placed in this building, and the number of people who could have had that information was very, very small. "Dr. Webb," she said, "where is he now?" Carver was already on her radio, a 30-second exchange with the MP unit. She looked up from the radio with an expression that Rebecca had learned to read in people who delivered bad news professionally. "He's gone," Carver said. "The MPs swept the basement level 20 minutes ago. No one was there. The badge log shows him entering the stairwell at 22:03, but there's no exit record. He either disabled his badge or he found an exit that isn't on the active sensor grid." Rebecca turned to Hutchins. "Is there an exit from the basement that isn't on the sensor grid?" "There shouldn't be." "But is there?" He was already moving and already on his own radio, already issuing the kind of rapid, precise instructions that she recognized from 2 years of working under him. She followed him out of the conference room back into the corridor toward the stairwell. The basement level of San Diego Naval Medical Center smelled like concrete and server cooling, and the particular sterile chill of a room kept at a constant low temperature to protect the equipment inside it. The MPs had done a sweep. She could see the pattern of their movement in the disturbed dust near the server room door, but they had swept quickly under pressure in an active situation, and she had learned early in her career that quick sweeps under pressure miss things. She had also learned that the things they missed were rarely accidental. She moved through the basement the same way she moved through everything systematically without rushing, trusting her eyes and her instincts in equal measure. The server room was on the right. The pharmaceutical cold storage was straight ahead. Between them, almost invisible against the wall unless you knew to look for breaks in the surface, was a door. Not a fire door, not a utility access. A door that had been painted the same color as the surrounding wall at some point in the building's history by someone who either had a very good reason or a very bad one. She put her hand flat against it. Metal, cool to the touch. She pressed and it moved, not locked, not even fully latched, and behind it was a staircase going up. A maintenance staircase, original construction, predating the modern layout of the building by at least 30 years. Hutchins, she said. He was beside her in 6 seconds. He looked at the door. He looked at her. 30 years, he said. This building has been here 30 years, and I have never known this was here. Webb knew, she said. He had 8 months to learn this building. She looked at the staircase. She looked at Hutchins. She made the calculation in under 2 seconds, the same way she always made it, and she stepped through the door. O'Connell, Hutchins said. You need to call the perimeter, she said over her shoulder. The staircase exits somewhere on the north or east face of the building. I'll push him toward you. She heard him behind her, not following because he understood operational logic even when it frustrated him, heard his radio come alive, heard him issuing the perimeter call. She moved up the staircase. It was dark. She had her phone and she turned on the flashlight, holding it low, not above chest height, because she did not want to silhouette herself. The stairs were concrete, old, and they made no sound under her shoes, which was one of the reasons she'd worn the specific shoes she wore. Soft soles, minimal heel. She had learned to always wear the shoes. The staircase turned at a landing. Then again. She counted the levels she was going up, 3 floors, which put her at ground level or slightly above. The air changed. She smelled night air, the faint salt of the bay, carried inland on the wind. A door above her. Gray light at its edges, exterior facing east. She stopped. She listened. Breathing. Close, controlled, but not controlled enough. The breathing of a man who thought he was alone. She put her phone in her pocket. She put her back against the wall of the staircase below the sight line of the door, and she knocked twice on the concrete wall. Sharp, distinct. The sound a pipe makes when it settles. The breathing changed. Stopped for 2 seconds. Started again faster. He thought the building was talking. She was giving him one small spike of adrenaline to work with, the kind that makes people move before they should. The door opened. She heard him step through, and she was already through the door behind him, into the dark exterior stairwell above the maintenance level, and he turned and she caught his wrist, before his hand fully raised the object in it, a phone, not a weapon. He was trying to make a call, and she pulled his arm behind him and put him against the wall with enough controlled force that the phone fell and skittered across the concrete. Marcus Webb, she said. He was breathing very fast. He was not a fighter she'd known, that from the moment she heard his breathing in the staircase, too much panic in it, not enough preparation, and the absence of any physical resistance told her the rest. He was a facilitator, not an operator. He'd provided access, provided information, and expected to be long gone before anyone looked for him. Let me go, he said. I'm a doctor. I work here. You're assaulting a... You badged into the basement access stairwell 11 minutes before 6 armed men breached this building, she said. Your access data is on a Defense Intelligence Agency tablet right now. So let's not do that. He went quiet. Who hired you? She said. Silence. Webb, I just spent an hour putting down 6 men who were better trained than you and had better equipment. I am tired and my wrist hurts, and I have approximately 0 patience for the part where you don't answer me. Who hired you? I can't tell you that. His voice was thin. You don't understand. If I tell you, they'll what? Come after you. She kept her pressure on his arm controlled, not punitive, exactly enough to communicate that the option of leaving was not currently on the table. Webb, the 6 men who were supposed to get what you helped them find are now in military police custody. Their operation failed. That means whoever hired them is already making new plans, and the first item on that list is eliminating anyone who can connect them to tonight. Which is you, she paused. Talking to me is not your risk. Staying silent is your risk. Do you understand that? She felt him process it, felt the shift in his body the way a person's whole frame changes when they move from one decision to another. There was a man, he said. I never met him in person. It was all encrypted communication. He knew things about me, things I'd done before I came here, things that would end my career. He paused. Things that would end more than my career. Blackmail. He said all I had to do was give him the layout, tell him about the basement, tell him about the security rotation. A tremor had entered his voice, something that was genuinely not performance. He said no one would get hurt, that they just needed access to a server for a few minutes. And you believe that? He didn't answer. The man on the trigger tonight pressed a gun against a 19-year-old's head, she said. So no, they were not going to leave without hurting someone. She released the pressure on his arm fractionally. The communication was it one way. He could initiate contact, he could respond. Did you respond tonight before or during the breach? A beat too long. Once, I confirmed the security rotation had changed, that the night shift had 2 fewer MPs than usual because of a scheduling conflict. He stopped. That was 3 hours ago. She processed that. 3 hours ago, he had confirmed the reduced security presence, which meant whoever was coordinating this operation had been actively monitoring the situation right up to the breach, adjusting in real time, making decisions. This was not a plan drawn up 6 months ago and executed on a fixed date. It was a live operation, responsive, adaptive, which meant the person running it was good. When was the last time he contacted you? 22:15, right before he stopped, right before the breach team went in, a final status check, and then silence because the operation had either succeeded or it hadn't, and either way his handler would have been watching. And his handler had just watched Rebecca O'Connell put 6 men on the floor in 11 minutes. She thought about what that meant. She thought about a man somewhere in a car, in a room on the other end of an encrypted channel, watching his operation fall apart, watching the asset he'd sent not come back, watching the building fill up with military police, and recalculating. She thought about what recalculation looked like from that position. She thought about what it meant that they had cloned her badge. They had known she was in this building. They had built a contingency around her, which meant that when the operation failed and they started looking for someone to hold accountable for the failure, the badge log they had manufactured would be their first move. A paper trail pointing at her. A classified operative cover already blown with fabricated evidence of involvement in the breach. She was not just a witness to tonight. She was being set up to be the story of tonight. The door at the base of the exterior stairwell opened. 2 MPs and Hutchins coming up fast. She stepped back from Webb and let them take him. Hutchins looked at her. He talked enough to get started. She looked at the phone on the ground. Bag that. Don't let anyone but Carver's team access the communication history. She paused. And Dale, the badge log, the cloned credential. Someone built a case against me before tonight happened. We need to get ahead of it. Hutchins' expression was controlled, but she knew him well enough to see what moved underneath it. How far ahead? Far enough that whoever is looking at that badge log right now, and someone is looking at it right now, doesn't get to write the first draft of this story. He nodded. He handed Webb to one of the MPs and stepped closer to her. He lowered his voice. I want you to know something. Before any debrief, before any formal statement, I want you to know that there is no version of tonight where your record reflects anything other than what actually happened. Someone with enough access to run a disinformation operation against a placed operative has enough access to write whatever record they want, she said. Not if I write it first. She looked at him. This was what she had never been entirely sure of across 2 years of working under him and 1 year of walking away. Whether his protection of her was institutional, the way a commanding officer protects an asset, or something else. Whether the difference mattered. She decided, standing on an exterior stairwell at 3 a.m. with her wrists bruising and an insider in custody and a fabricated badge log somewhere in a federal database, that the difference mattered less than the outcome. Then write it fast, she said. They went back inside. The ER was quiet when she passed through it. Reyes was asleep in his bay. She checked his drainage out of habit, found it stable, noted it in the chart. Paula was at the station, not asleep, keeping herself occupied with paperwork, the way people occupied themselves when the adrenaline was gone, and they didn't want to be alone with the silence. How are you doing? Rebecca asked. Paula looked up. Her eyes were tired, and in them was the particular look that people wore when they had revised their understanding of something and weren't yet sure what to do with the revision. "I don't know," she said. "I thought I knew you." "You do know me," Rebecca said. "You know I take my coffee black, and I'm always 10 minutes early, and I don't eat the fish from the cafeteria because of a thing that happened in 2019 that I've never told anyone about." Paula almost smiled. "You're not what I thought you were." "I'm exactly what I thought I was," Rebecca said. "I'm a nurse who has a more complicated resume than most, that's all." "That's a significant understatement." "Most true things are." Paula was quiet for a moment. "What happens to you now?" It was the question Rebecca had been not quite asking herself for the past hour in the margins of every other calculation. What happened to her now? The cover was gone, the placement was over. Hutchins had said something about what comes next, had said there might be a version of what she did that didn't require her to be anyone other than who she was, and she had not yet decided what to do with that, whether it was an offer she believed in or a well-intentioned idea from a man who had never quite understood that the thing she wanted wasn't a different kind of operational role. The thing she wanted was to be a nurse, to be the person she was in this building, in this ward, before six armed men came through the door and forced the other part of her into the light. The two parts had always been the same person. She was only now beginning to understand that that was allowed. "I don't know yet," she told Paula, "but I'm here for the rest of this shift." Paula looked at her for a long moment. Then she slid a chart across the counter. "Base 7 needs a medication check. The patient's been asking for someone for the past hour." Rebecca picked up the chart. She walked to base 7. She pulled back the curtain. The patient was an older man, 70s Korean War veteran, if the admission notes were right, in for a cardiac monitoring follow-up. He was awake, sitting upright, watching her with clear, sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're the one who handled those men tonight," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. In a hospital at 3 in the morning, information moved through the walls. "I'm your nurse," she said. "How are you feeling?" Like a man who's seen a lot of things in his life and thought he'd seen most of what there was to see. He paused. "I was wrong." She checked his monitor. His heart rate was slightly elevated, understandable, but his rhythm was clean. "You were in the military," he said, "a long time ago." "Not so long," he said. He looked at her the way old soldiers looked at people they recognized across the distance of decades in different uniforms. "You still stand like it. You still move like it." He was quiet for a moment. "And thank you for what you did tonight, for all of us in here." She noted his heart rate in the chart. She adjusted his monitor alert threshold. She did the small, precise, necessary work of keeping a person's body informed and supported through the night. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll check on you in an hour." She pulled the curtain back into place and stood in the corridor for a moment, chart in hand, the building humming around her. Down the hall, she heard Hutchins' voice, low, rapid, authoritative, and Carver's response in the sound of a door closing. The debrief would happen before morning. The formal process would begin. The machinery of military intelligence, once activated, moved with its own momentum, and she would be inside it whether she chose it or not. But that was in an hour, maybe 2. Right now, she was in this building, in this ward, and there were patients in every bay who needed exactly what she was there to provide. And she had always believed, had been trained to believe, it had chosen to believe it beyond, and after the training, that the most important skill was the one the moment required. She moved to the next bay and pulled back the curtain. She started her second round of the night. The debrief started at 4:15 in the morning in a conference room on the 3rd floor that smelled like cold coffee and institutional carpet, and it lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. And by the end of it, Rebecca knew 3 things she hadn't known when she walked in. The first was that the man who had coordinated the operation against the hospital, the one who had blackmailed Marcus Webb, who had cloned her badge, who had sent 6 armed men through the service entrance on a Wednesday night, had a name, or at least a name that he used. The DIA agent Carver had pulled it from the encrypted communication log on Webb's phone within 40 minutes of taking custody of the device. The name was Aldrich Sohn, and it meant nothing to Rebecca, which was itself significant because very few names in the operational world meant nothing to her. The second thing she knew was that Aldrich Sohn had accessed the classified database that contained her placement record. Not her full file was compartmented at a level that required 3 concurrent authorizations to open, But the placement record, the thin document that confirmed a specific operative, was assigned to a specific facility. Someone inside the authorization chain had either been compromised or had made a choice, and the DIA was running that investigation concurrently. And from the look on Carver's face when she said concurrently, Rebecca understood that the investigation was already pointing somewhere that made senior people uncomfortable. The third thing she knew was the one that changed everything else. Aldrich Sohn had not come for the servers in the basement. He had come for one specific file on those servers, a personnel record, her personnel record, the full one, the one that required 3 concurrent authorizations, and that she had been assured multiple times across multiple years was beyond the reach of anyone who wasn't sitting in a very specific room in the Pentagon with a very specific set of keys. He had known she was there. He had come for her file. He had sent 6 men to create a diversion, used a blackmail doctor to open the basement, and manufactured a badge log to frame her, all to access a document that would tell him exactly who she had been and everything she had done. She sat with that for a long moment after Carver finished speaking. He wanted to know my history, she said. He wanted your operational record, Carver said. 4 years of missions, every name, every location, every contact and asset and action in every theater. To sell it? That's our working assumption. The market for that kind of intelligence on a former SEAL program operative is significant. State actors, non-state actors, private contractors. Carver paused. There are also people in your operational history who might want that record for reasons that aren't commercial. Rebecca understood what she meant. People who wanted to know who had been responsible for things that had happened to them, or to people they cared about in places that didn't officially exist. People with long memories and longer grudges and the resources to act on both. Hutchins was watching her from across the table. He'd barely spoken during the debrief. He had the quality of a man who listened completely before he said anything, which was one of the things she had respected about him and also one of the things that had occasionally driven her to the edge of patience, and now he spoke. The file was not accessed, he said. The basement team never reached the servers. The file is intact. But Sohn is still out there, she said. Yes. And he knows the operation failed. Yes. Which means he knows I'm the reason it failed. Hutchins looked at her steadily. Yes. She stood up and walked to the window. The parking lot below was still lit by the tail end of the MP and crime scene presence, though it had thinned over the past hour. The sky to the east had begun its preliminary shift, the deep black softening at the edges into something that wasn't yet light, but was the memory of light. She watched it for a moment. He'll come at me directly now, she said. The indirect approach failed. He spent significant resources on an operation that returned nothing, and he has a name and a partial profile on me, but not the full file, which means he has enough to be dangerous and not enough to be satisfied. That's our assessment, Carver said. So what's the proposed response? The room was quiet. She turned from the window. Hutchins said relocation, new placement, new cover deeper this time. She looked at him. No. O'Connell. I said no. She returned to the table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the surface the way she did when she wanted to communicate that she was done deliberating and had arrived somewhere. I have spent years being relocated. I have spent years being placed and covered and run as an asset in facilities and locations that I was told were safe until they weren't. I am done with that structure. She met his eyes. I want to be a nurse. Here, in this hospital. Under my own name with my full record accessible to whoever needs to verify my credentials. And I want whoever is coming for me to have to come for me in a place where I know every exit and every supply cabinet and every 13-foot stretch of corridor by memory. She paused. That's my counteroffer. The silence in the room was the particular silence of people recalculating what they thought was possible. General Okafor, who had been present for the entire debrief and had said approximately 12 words during it, looked at her now with the expression she had seen develop across the course of the night, something that had started as skepticism and traveled a considerable distance. You want to use yourself as bait, he said. I want to do my job, she said, in my building. If that creates an opportunity to resolve a threat that will otherwise follow me wherever I go, That's not bait. That's efficiency. Carver said, the DIA can't officially sanction. I'm not asking for a sanction, Rebecca said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The sanction question is one for Commander Hutchins and the General, and they can decide whether they want the DIA's resources supporting it or whether I handle it as a private citizen who happens to work in a federal facility. Carver looked at Hutchins. Hutchins looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at Rebecca with the eyes of a man who had commanded several thousand people across a 30-year career and could count on one hand the number of them who had made him feel that the outcome of a discussion had been settled before it began. You finish your shift, Okafor said. We finish the site debrief. We reassess at 0800. He stood. And someone get this woman a better cup of coffee than whatever that is. He left. Carver gathered her tablet and her files and followed, and the room was down to Rebecca and Hutchins and the particular quality of silence that existed between two people who had a history that didn't require filling. You knew he was going to come for the file eventually, she said. That's why you placed me, not just because this facility was a target, because you knew the target was me and you needed me inside a building I could control. He didn't look away. I knew there was intelligence that a former operative from your program was being tracked. I didn't know it was you specifically until 3 weeks before your placement. And you didn't tell me. If I'd told you, you would have run, he said, not from fear, from principle. You would have decided you were a danger to whoever was around you, and you would have gone somewhere remote and alone, and you would have handled it by yourself. He paused. You've always handled everything by yourself. She felt the truth of that in a way she hadn't expected. She had built the entire architecture of her post-service life around self-sufficiency, the sparse apartment, the laced shoes, the go-bag, because self-sufficiency was the thing she trusted. Other people were variables. She was a constant. She had believed that the only person she could be certain of was herself. She wasn't sure right now, sitting across from Dale Hutchins in a conference room at nearly 7 in the morning, with a bruised wrist and the smell of gunpowder still faint in her hair, whether that belief had been protecting her or just a different kind of hiding. You should have told me, she said, but she said it quietly. I know, he said. I'm sorry. She absorbed that. He didn't apologize often. When he did, he meant it. She had learned to take it at face value because taking things at face value with Hutchins was almost always the right call. The debrief is going to reach Washington by morning, she said. My name attached to a facility breach even as the person who stopped it. There are people in that chain who will use it. I know that too. How bad? He was honest with her, which was the least she'd expected, and sometimes more than she'd gotten. There's a deputy director in the Intelligence Oversight Committee who has been building a case for the last 18 months that SEAL-adjacent medical programs should be dissolved and their personnel formally discharged from any operational standing. Tonight gives him material to work with. He'll say, I'm a liability. He'll say the program produced liabilities. You specifically, he'll call a public safety concern, an operative working in a civilian-adjacent capacity with a history of, he stopped, with a history of what? Hutchins met her eyes, with a history of classified actions that he believes were excessive. There were inquiries after the third deployment. You were cleared fully, but the inquiries are in the record. And a man who wants to build a case will use a cleared inquiry the same way he'd use a finding. She understood. The law operated on evidence. Politics operated on implication. The deputy director didn't need a finding. He needed a headline. An armed standoff at military hospital was a headline that could be written many different ways depending on who held the pen. Her jaw tightened. She breathed through it. When does he get the report? The base commander files with Joint Chiefs by 0900. The Oversight Committee has access within the hour after that. So we have 2 hours. Roughly. She stood up. She was tired in the way that settled into the body after a sustained adrenal event, not sleepy but heavy, every muscle having fully registered what it had done in the night and beginning to present its bill. She ignored it the way she ignored all physical information that wasn't actionable right now. I need to make a call, she said. To whom? Someone who owes me a significant favor and who has more direct access to the Joint Chiefs morning briefing than your deputy director has to the Oversight Committee. She paused. Don't ask me how I know that. He almost smiled. I wasn't going to. She left the conference room and walked to the stairwell, the regular one, not the hidden maintenance shaft, and went down to the first floor, and then outside through a side door into the thin early air of a San Diego morning that was just beginning to understand it was morning. The sky had moved from soft black to a dark bruised blue, and the bay was somewhere beyond the buildings and the streets, and she could smell it. She had a number in her phone under a contact name that was a place she had never been and had no intention of going. She pressed it. It rang 4 times. She counted. "This is an unsecured line," said the voice on the other end. Male 60 or so, slightly hoarse in the way of a man who had been awake since the previous morning for reasons of his own. "I know," she said. "I'll be brief. San Diego Naval Medical Center. Last night. You'll have the incident report within the hour. I need the narrative secured before the oversight committee gets a version written by someone with an agenda." A pause. "O'Connell." "Yes. I heard there was a situation." "There was a situation. I resolved it. What I need is for the resolution to be the story and not the situation." Another pause. She heard him breathing, heard the sounds of an office of someone who worked in places that never fully slept. "You're asking me to make a call." "I'm calling in the favor." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She had learned patience from a man who had learned it from a man who had learned it somewhere she would never know, and she had applied it every day for 4 years in places where impatience got people killed, and she applied it now in a parking lot in San Diego at 6:50 in the morning because the principle didn't change with the geography. "The call gets made," he said finally. "But O'Connell, this clears the debt." "Understood. And you're going to need to be very visible in that building for the next 72 hours. Whatever they say about you, your presence on that ward is the counter-argument." "I'm aware. Are you actually a good nurse?" She almost laughed. It came up in her chest unexpectedly, not quite fully formed, more like the shape of a laugh in the space where a laugh would go. "I'm an excellent nurse," she said. "Then go do that." He ended the call. She stood outside for another minute. The air was cool and real, and she breathed it until her chest felt less like a closed room and more like itself. Then she went back inside. Hutchins was in the corridor near the ER entrance, talking quietly with one of the MPs. He looked up when she came through the door. "Handled," he said. "Handled." She stopped beside him. "I need you to do something." "Name it." "The 6 men in custody. The one who pressed the gun to Reyes's head, the leader. He's the one who'll talk eventually if the right pressure is applied. He's not ideological. He was hired. Hired men who get abandoned by their employers get angry, and angry men talk." She paused. "Make sure whoever interviews him knows to let him be angry before they start asking questions. Anger is not the obstacle. It's the opening." Hutchins looked at her for a moment. "Any other operational guidance for the DIA?" "I'll write it up if they want it," she said, and walked past him into the ER. The morning shift was beginning to arrive. She could feel it, the change in energy, the fresh faces replacing the exhausted ones, the metabolism of the building cycling toward daytime. Marcus was still at the station. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the night, but he was upright and functional. And when she came in, he straightened in a way that told her the night had done something to the hierarchy of the room that hadn't existed before. "How are the patients?" she said. "All stable. Reyes is still asleep. The cardiac patient in Bay 7 asked about you twice." She nodded. She went to the sink and washed her hands, a reflex so deep it was automatic, the first act of medicine before everything else, and dried them and picked up the chart Marcus offered her. She had been awake for 26 hours. She had neutralized 6 armed men identified and apprehended. An insider run a debrief with federal agents, made a call that might or might not preserve her career, and was now standing in the emergency room of a military hospital at 7 in the morning, preparing to do it all over again in a quieter key. She was exactly where she wanted to be. Paula came out of the medication room. She stopped when she saw Rebecca. She crossed the room, and without saying anything, she put her arms around her. It was brief and it was real, and Rebecca stood inside it and felt with an almost physical impact the difference between being known and being seen. "Go home," Rebecca said when Paula stepped back. "Sleep." "What about you? I've got the handoff covered. Go." Paula looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had made a decision about something and intended to stick with it. I'm putting in a formal recommendation, she said, for your nursing performance. Not for the other thing, for the nursing. The way you handled the patients, the way you kept everyone functional, the way you moved through this ward last night without once losing track of what we were here to do. That's separate from everything else, and it deserves to be on record. Rebecca didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about what it meant to be recommended for the thing you'd spent 6 weeks hoping someone would see. Thank you, she said. She meant it simply without modification, which was the only way she knew how to mean things. Paula left. The morning shift moved in around her like a tide, and she let it, and she was part of it, and the day started. At 8:17, Hutchins appeared in the doorway of the ER and caught her eye from across the room. He gave her a small nod. One nod. The kind that communicated a specific outcome without requiring the words. The narrative had been secured. The call had been made. The deputy director's version of events would not be the first version on the Joint Chief's desk this morning. She turned back to her patient. At 9:03, Reyes woke up. She was in his bay when he did updating his chart, and he opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man remembering everything that had happened to him in a single telescoped instant. You're still here, he said. I'm on shift, she said. He turned his head and looked at her. In the daylight coming through the window, real daylight, now full and yellow and direct, he looked younger than he had the night before, and she realized that was because the fear was gone. Fear aged people. Its removal was a kind of restoration. My mom is coming, he said. I called her, like you said. Good. She cried, he said, which made me cry, which I would like to state, for the record, is not something I do. I won't tell anyone. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you become a nurse? I mean, after everything else you did. Why was this? She considered the question the way she considered things that mattered, which was fully and without rushing. Because in every situation I was ever in, she said the moment that mattered most was never the moment of the threat. It was the moment after. The moment when somebody needed someone to be steady and present and capable. She paused. Combat medicine gave me that. Nursing gave me that every day without the parts in between that I needed to leave behind. He nodded slowly. You're really good at it, he said, in the nursing part, not just the other part, the actual nursing. She thought of Paula's recommendation. She thought of the cardiac patient in Bay 7 who had looked at her with the eyes of a man who had seen the world and revised his understanding of it. She thought of Marcus handing her the coffee without being asked, and Deb saying Mouse was a stupid nickname, and the thin sound of Reyes calling his mother from a hospital bed in San Diego at 3 a.m. I know, she said, and for the first time in 6 weeks she said it without qualification, without the careful smallness she had worn like a coat. She said it like a person who had finally decided that knowing a thing and saying a thing were not required to be different operations. She updated his chart. She checked his drainage. She told him the orthopedic consult would be in by 10, and that his knee, despite the events of the previous evening, remained on schedule for the recovery Whitmore had projected. Then she went to Bay 7. The old man was awake, watching the door. When she came through the curtain, his face did the thing that old faces did when they were genuinely glad to see someone not performed, not polite, but the real thing, the thing that couldn't be faked. You came back, he said. I said I would. She checked his monitor. His heart rate was steady, his rhythm clean, his blood pressure within the range they'd been targeting. His body was doing what bodies were supposed to do when you gave them the right support in enough time. How long have you been a nurse? He asked. 6 weeks here, she said. In another form most of my adult life. He nodded. He seemed to understand what that meant, or at least to accept that he understood what he was going to get from her, and that it was enough. My granddaughter wants to be a doctor, he said. She's 14, wants to go to Johns Hopkins. Tell her to go, Rebecca said, and tell her the emergency department is where the real work is. He smiled. It was a full smile, the kind that used the eyes. I'll tell her. He paused. What's your name, your full name? I want to remember who took care of me. She looked at him, at the clear, sharp eyes that missed nothing, at the face of a man who had survived a war and several decades beyond it and had come to a hospital and ended up inside a different kind of night than he'd expected, and who was asking her simply to be real. Rebecca O'Connell, she said, registered nurse. He repeated it once quietly, like he was filing it somewhere he intended to keep it. Outside the bay, she heard the morning shift moving through its rhythms, voices, and monitors, and the particular organized energy of a ward that had been through something and was choosing collectively to function anyway. She heard Whitmore's voice at the far end, authoritative but different from the night before the condescension filed away somewhere he might or might not retrieve it. She heard Marcus on the phone and the morning resident asking about Bay 2 and the ordinary, necessary, unspectacular machinery of keeping people alive. She straightened the old man's blanket. She made a note in his chart. She told him she'd be back in 2 hours and that breakfast would come before then and that he should eat it, even the eggs, which she personally found institutional, but which had the caloric value he needed. He laughed. It was a good sound. She pulled the curtain and walked back to the nurse's station, and the morning opened around her, and she was in it, and it was enough. The morning did not stay quiet. She had known it wouldn't. Quiet in her experience was not a state that followed events like the previous night. It was a pause, a held breath, the moment before the next thing arrived. She had learned to use those pauses efficiently to eat when she could, and move when she could, and rest her mind in the spaces between demands, because the next demand was always coming, and the only variable was when. It arrived at 10:47 in the form of a man she had never seen before, wearing a suit that cost more than most people at this hospital, made in a month, walking into the emergency room, with the particular posture of someone who had never needed to announce himself because his presence had always been sufficient announcement. He was mid-50s, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that expressed nothing while communicating everything, and he was followed by two people carrying folders who moved like assistants trained to be invisible. Rebecca clocked him from the nurse's station and knew exactly what he was before he opened his mouth. She had sat across from men like this in rooms that didn't officially exist and understood their taxonomy precisely. This was a political animal, not military, not intelligence. Political. The suit was Washington, the posture was committee, and the timing, 10:47, the morning after a facility breach that had been reported to the Joint Chiefs at 9, was not a coincidence. He stopped at the center of the ER and looked around with the unhurried deliberateness of a man conducting an inspection he had already decided the outcome of. His eyes found her. "Rebecca O'Connell," he said, not a question. "That's me," she said. She kept the chart in her hand. She kept her posture, what it always was, present, functional, unimpressed. "My name is Lawrence Holt, Deputy Director of the Congressional Intelligence Oversight Subcommittee." He said the full title with the practiced ease of someone who had said it 10,000 times and understood its effect on people. "I'd like a few minutes of your time." "I'm on shift," she said. "I'm aware. This won't take long." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the call she'd made in the parking lot at 6:50 in the morning. She thought about the nod Hutchins had given her at 8:17. She thought about what Hutchins had said, that Holt had been building a case for 18 months, that he would use the incident, that he needed a headline, and now he had one. She set down the chart. "Conference room is on 3, she said. "I'll be up in 5 minutes. He nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had expected resistance and was faintly disappointed not to find it. He went toward the elevator. She watched him go and then turned to Marcus. "Call me if anything changes in bays 2, 4, or 7, she said. "I'll have my phone." Marcus looked at the retreating figure of Holt and his assistants. "Who is that?" "Someone who thinks last night was an opportunity," she said. "He's about to find out it wasn't." She gave herself the 5 minutes she'd promised. She used them to check on Reyes, whose mother had arrived, a small, fierce woman from El Paso, who had held her son's hand with both of hers and looked at Rebecca with the particular intensity of a parent who understands that another person stood between their child and something irreversible, and to look in on the cardiac patient in Bay 7 who was eating his eggs with the concentrated focus of a man who had decided that institutional food was a small price to pay for being alive. Then she went upstairs. Holt had arranged himself at the head of the conference table, his assistants flanking him, their folders open. He had not poured himself water from the pitcher on the side table. He had not adjusted his jacket. He was exactly as she'd left him, as if he'd simply paused himself while she was gone. She sat down across from him. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "Last night's incident raises significant concerns about the placement of operatives with classified backgrounds in facilities that interact with civilian and active duty personnel in a medical capacity." He opened the folder in front of him with a single practice motion. Your record, as much of it as I have access to, indicates a pattern of high-risk actions taken under classified authorization across a 4-year operational period. 3 of those actions are currently the subject of sealed inquiries. Cleared inquiries, she said. All 3. Cleared through a chain of command that includes several of the same individuals who authorized your current placement. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had practiced a long time at delivering implications without stating them directly. I think you can understand why that creates a question of independence. I understand why you'd frame it that way, she said. I'd frame it differently. I imagine you would. He turned a page. Last night, a breach of this facility resulted in 6 individuals being physically incapacitated by a single nursing staff member using improvised weapons and unarmed combat techniques. 2 of those individuals sustained injuries requiring medical assessment before transport, which I saw him. 1 sustained a fracture. He paused. This happened in an active emergency room with patients present. It happened in an active emergency room because 6 armed men came through the door, she said. The patients were present because this is a hospital. The injuries the intruders sustained were the minimum required to neutralize the threat to those patients. She kept her voice even. I can walk you through the sequence of events in as much detail as you want, but the sequence starts with the man who put a gun against a 19-year-old corporal's head. Not with me. Holt looked at her with an expression that told her he had heard this kind of response before and had developed a technique for moving through it. No one is questioning your intent, he said. What we're questioning is the structure. An operative with your history placed in a civilian-adjacent facility without full disclosure to hospital administration. I was placed by Commander Dale Hutchins with the full knowledge of the base commander, she said. General Okafor was briefed on the placement parameters within 48 hours of my arrival. Holt went very still. She watched him process that. She watched the calculation run across his face, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, and she saw the specific moment when he understood that the information he'd come here with, the version of the story where a rogue operative had been hidden inside a facility without proper oversight, was not the information on the table. Okafor was briefed, he said. Yes, that's not in the report I received this morning. The report you received this morning was the preliminary incident report filed by the watch officer at 0300. The full command report, including the placement authorization chain, was filed separately by General Okafor directly to the Joint Chiefs at 9:15. She paused. I'd imagine you'll have access to it within the hour. The silence in the room was the kind that had a texture. She could feel it. One of Holt's assistants leaned in and murmured something. Holt did not look at them. He was looking at her. He was doing the same thing she did when a situation she had mapped in advance turned out to have a different topography. He was reorienting, identifying where he actually was, updating the plan. She respected the skill, even while she was using it against him. You made calls this morning, he said. It was not a question. I made 1 call, she said, to someone who had relevant information that I thought the appropriate people should have before the formal reporting chain reached the committee level. She met his eyes. That's not obstruction. That's coordination. Depending on who you called and what you said, it could be characterized differently. Characterize it however you want, she said. The outcome is that the people responsible for oversight of operations like mine have accurate information instead of a preliminary report written at 3 in the morning by a watch officer who wasn't present for any of it. Holt closed the folder. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and she watched him make a decision, and the decision took about 8 seconds, which was longer than she'd expected and which told her something about the complexity of what he was weighing. You know what I came here to do, he said. I know what you plan to do, she said, based on what you expected to find. And what did I expect to find? An operative who had acted outside her sanctioned parameters in a way that created liability. Someone whose presence in this building could be framed as a risk that the program had failed to manage. A story, she said, that would give you the material you needed to dismantle a program you've been targeting for 18 months. He didn't deny it. She gave him credit for that. A lesser political operator would have performed outrage. He simply sat with the accuracy of it and let the silence speak. The program has problems, he said finally. Legitimate ones. I know it does, she said. I lived inside it. I left it for reasons that are in my record, cleared or not, and those reasons were real. She leaned forward slightly. But what happened here last night is not one of those problems. What happened last night is the opposite. Someone tried to access classified information about a former operative through a violent breach of a medical facility. The operative in question used her training to protect 23 people and prevent a significant intelligence compromise. That's the story. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you want? He said. You're saying the leak goes higher than Webb, he said. I'm saying Webb didn't have access to the information that Sohan used to blackmail him. Someone gave Sohan what he needed to compromise Webb. That means someone with higher clearance than a staff internist has been feeding Sohan for months. She held his gaze. That's your investigation, Deputy Director. Not the program. Not me. That. When the conference room was very quiet, then Holt did something she hadn't expected. He picked up the folder, the one he'd come in with, the one with her record and the incident report and the carefully assembled architecture of the case he'd planned to build, and he closed it. He closed it with a finality that communicated something she couldn't quite name, but recognized as consequential. I need full access to the communication logs from last night, he said, and I need a direct briefing with Carver's team. Hutchins can arrange that, she said. He nodded. He stood. His assistants stood with him. He looked at her once more, and in his face she saw the residue of the morning's recalibration, the way a plan that had been solid at 8 in the morning was now something different, pointing somewhere different, requiring different movement. O'Connell, he said, for what it's worth, the program has been badly managed. That's still true. I know it is, she said, but you weren't the problem. No, she said, I wasn't. He left. She sat in the conference room alone for approximately 90 seconds, long enough to let the tension of the conversation metabolize, long enough to breathe and take stock. Her hands were steady. Her chest was clear. She had walked into that room knowing where the exits were, and she had used all of them. She went back downstairs. Hutchins was waiting in the corridor outside the ER. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had been monitoring the situation from a distance and was now assessing the outcome. How did it go, he said. Holt is going to redirect his committee towards Sohan, she said. He'll need your cooperation on the intelligence handoff. Hutchins blinked, just once, but she saw it. He came here to build a case against the program, and he's leaving to investigate Sohan. He came here with incomplete information, she said. I gave him better information. He was quiet for a moment. You are, he said slowly, the most effective person I have ever worked with. I know, she said. You should have told me that more often when it would have done some good. She went back into the ER. The afternoon moved differently from the morning. There was a rhythm to it, the specific rhythm of a ward that has been through something and is making a collective, unspoken decision to hold itself together. The staff worked with a precision that had an edge of something extra in it, not performance, but the particular focus of people who have discovered something true about themselves under pressure and are still orienting to it. Marcus ran the supply check without being asked. Dev took an extra patient load so the overnight staff could be debriefed without the ward shorting. Paula, who had been told to go home and sleep and had instead apparently gone home, showered, and come back, appeared at the nurse's station at 1 in the afternoon with 2 cups of good coffee and a look on her face that communicated that she was done being surprised by anything. Whitmore found Rebecca at 3:15. She was updating charts at the station when he came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual. Whitmore had never been a man comfortable with silence. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at a point slightly past her left shoulder, and she gave him the silence and waited. I owe you more than an apology, he said finally. I owe you an accounting. She looked at him. You don't owe me anything. I called you Mouse, he said, out loud, in front of the team, on your 3rd day. He paused. I said it because you appeared somewhere I didn't expect you to be, and I was startled, and I didn't think about what I was saying. I didn't think about you as a person who was new to this place and trying to build something here. He met her eyes. I thought about my own discomfort, and I said something, and it became a name, and you carried it for 6 weeks, Tomarasu. I didn't mind it, she said. She had said this before. She meant it the same amount both times. You should have, he said. That's the point. You should have minded, and the fact that you didn't, He stopped. The fact that you didn't says something about what you're used to tolerating that I don't think reflects well on the environments that produced it. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a comfortable man, Carl Whitmore, but he was an honest one, and honesty at its most useful was often uncomfortable. She thought about all the environments she had passed through, all the rooms where she had been the smallest person and the quietest person and the person most likely to be underestimated, and all the ways she had learned to make that work for her, and all the things she had never asked herself about, whether making it work was the same as it being acceptable. "Thank you," she said, and she meant that simply too. He nodded. He picked up a chart. He became Whitmore again, efficient, clinical, moving toward the next problem, but differently. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and the space it occupied now was real, and she thought that was probably the most any of them could ask of each other. At 4:40, Carver called her cell phone. "The leader talked," she said without preamble. Rebecca had given Carver her number during the debrief, and Carver had filed it and apparently used it when she had something to say, which was the kind of operational efficiency Rebecca appreciated. "What did he give you?" "Enough. Someone contacted him through a cutout 3 months ago, hired the team through an intermediary, paid in cryptocurrency non-traceable on first pass, but our financial analysts are working it." A pause. "He also gave us something else. The original intelligence about your placement, the document that identified you as the operative in this building. Sohn didn't get it from Webb." She stopped walking. She was in the corridor near the supply closet, and she stopped completely. Where did he get it? It came from outside the standard authorization chain. Someone accessed the placement record using a credential that belonged to a retired officer. The officer is deceased, died 8 months ago. Someone kept his credentials active and used them. 8 months ago, the same timeline as the gaps in the committee's investigation of Sohn, the same timeline as Webb's assignment to this facility. "The deceased officer," she said. "What was his name?" Carver told her. She had to sit down. She found the wall with her back and put her weight against it, and she let the name land, and she let it mean what it meant, and she breathed. The name Carver gave her was a man she had known. Not personally, not in the way of friends or confidants, but operationally. He had been a senior officer in the program during her second year. He had been present at 2 of the 3 inquiries. He had been the person who in the room had asked the hardest questions. She had believed at the time that he was doing his job. She had believed the questions were institutional due diligence. She understood now that he had been building a file. And when he died, someone had taken that file and his credentials and continued the work. "The credential access didn't die with him," she said. "No," Carver said. "Someone kept it active. We're running the access logs now. The person who used his credentials last night and 8 months ago and 6 months ago and twice in between is still active, still inside the authorization chain." Another pause. "Rebecca, this goes deep." "I know," she said. "The committee holds people. They're going to need everything we have." "Give it to them," she said. "All of it." She ended the call. She stayed against the wall for a moment. She thought about the architecture of the last 8 months, Webb's placement here, the operation last night, the badge clone, the cloned credential of a dead man, and she saw it whole for the first time, not as a series of threats, but as a single structure. Sohan had been preparing this for a long time. Not weeks, months. And the thing he had been preparing for was not the servers in the basement, not even her file specifically, but the use of her file. What he planned to do with it once he had it. She would find out what that was, not tonight, but she would find out. She pushed off the wall and walked back to the nurse's station. At 5:30, the day shift began its handoff to the evening crew, and Reyes was cleared to move to a step-down room for his orthopedic recovery, and his mother walked beside the bed with her hand on his arm and looked at Rebecca when they passed the station. "Thank you," she said in the simple way that people said things when there weren't words large enough for what they meant. "He's going to be fine," Rebecca said. "The knee will take time. He won't." The woman looked at her son, then back at Rebecca. "He told me what you did last night." She paused. "He said you looked at him and you gave him this small movement, like you were telling him it was going to be okay." "I was," Rebecca said. "Were you sure it was going to be okay?" Rebecca considered honesty in its fullest form, which was not the same as reassurance. "I was sure I was going to do everything I could to make it okay," she said. That's all anyone can promise. The woman nodded. That was enough. That was the truth, and she recognized it as the truth. And she took it and walked beside her son's bed down the corridor, and Rebecca watched them until the elevator doors closed. Hutchins found her at 6. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, real coffee from somewhere outside the building, and he handed her one without asking. She accepted it. There's been a development, he said. Carver called me. He looked at her. She called you first. She had my number. He absorbed that without comment. They stood together at the window, and the day outside was doing what days in San Diego did in late afternoon. All that Pacific light going golden at the edges, and it would have been beautiful if she'd had the space to notice it, and she had enough space to notice that she didn't have the space, which was something. The credential investigation is going to take time, he said. Whoever accessed the records using the dead officer's clearance is careful. They'll have covered their path. They always do, she said, until they don't. Give it to Carver's team and give them time. And Sohn? Holt's committee has enough to move on him. The financial trail from the cryptocurrency payment, the communication records from Webb's phone, the insertion point through the dead credential. That's 3 independent threads. Sohn has operated in the gaps between agencies. Holt can close the gaps. Hutchins looked at her sideways. You've thought this through. I had a quiet morning, she said. He almost laughed. It was a real sound, brief and genuine. She had missed that sound, she realized. In the years since she'd walked away, she had not recognized that she'd missed specific sounds until they returned. What happens now? He asked. It was the same question she'd asked him 2 nights ago in a different version of this moment. She gave him a different version of the answer. I finish my coffee, she said. I complete my shift notes, I go home, I sleep, and I come back tomorrow. And so, and whoever used that credential is still out there, she said. Yes, I know. She turned and looked at him directly. But I'm not running. I told you that at 4 in the morning, and I mean it. I know this building. I know this ward. I know the exits and the supply cabinets in the 13-foot stretches of corridor. And I know my patients, please. She paused. Anyone who comes for me here is making the same mistake the last 6 made. He looked at her for a long time. In his face was everything he had never said directly across 2 years of working together and 1 year of being apart, the respect and the frustration and the particular care of someone who had been responsible for a person's safety and had understood gradually that the person was substantially more capable of her own safety than he was of providing it. And underneath all of it, something simpler, something that had nothing to do with operations or programs or classified files. I'm glad you're here, he said. I know, she said. Go make your calls, Dale. He left. She finished the coffee. She completed her shift notes with the same precision she brought to everything, every medication logged, every vital recorded, every patient interaction documented in the plain functional language of clinical practice. That was its own kind of respect for the people in those beds. She checked on Bay 7 one last time. The old man was asleep, his cardiac rhythm tracing its steady line across the monitor, his breathing even and deep. She adjusted his blanket. She made a note. She stood beside him for a moment in the way she stood beside all her patients, not as a guardian or a protector or a warrior or any of the other words that the last 24 hours had introduced, but as a nurse, present, attentive. There, she went back to the station. She filed her last chart. She clocked out at 7:02, 2 minutes past the end of her shift, which was the most ordinary thing she had done in the last 24 hours, and also somehow exactly right. Marcus said goodnight. Dev said goodnight. The evening crew settled into their positions, and the ward kept moving as wards always did, indifferent to the dramas that played out inside them, sustained by the people who showed up every day and did the work. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She waited. Behind her, the ER moved and breathed and hummed with the particular life of a place that existed to keep people alive. And she had been part of that life for 6 weeks, and she would be part of it tomorrow, and the day after, and whatever came next, so on. The credential investigation Holt's committee, the full weight of the operational world that had followed her through the door would be met the way she met everything, with preparation and precision, and the knowledge that the most important thing she carried into any room was not a weapon or a record or a classified skill set, but the absolute unshakable certainty that she knew who she was. The elevator opened. Rebecca O'Connell, registered nurse, stepped inside. She was exactly where she belonged, and no one not so on, not a deputy director, not a ghost credential, or 6 armed men, or the accumulated weight of 4 classified years was ever going to take that from her again.